Welcome to Grill Country. Today is like Christmas in July for me because I'm just so excited about having two of my absolute favorite people on today, and Dr. Chris Green and Dr. Michael Martin. Both have been guests on Grill Country several times in the past, and I'm really glad to invite them back here again today. They're both going to be speakers at the conference that we have coming up in September, and I'm excited for that. Today, let me just tell you a little, in case you haven't seen Dr. Green or Dr. Martin before, let me just tell you a little bit about both of them. Dr. Green is a theologian, a teacher, a bishop, and an author. His recent books include All Things Beautiful, Toward an Aesthetic Christology, and The Fire and the Cloud. Which is part of a Christological trilogy that he's been working on. And you can find him on Substack at Speakeasy Theology. Dr. Michael Martin's books include Sophia in Exile and, oh, come on. Hey, I've read your book. This is hilarious because I've read your book.
Reality.
The Submerged Reality. That's the one I was trying to think of because I kept thinking of Transfiguration and said, yeah, thank you, Mike. So yeah, and the Submerged Reality, and you can find his Substack at The Druid Stares Back. And these are two of my all-time favorite conversation partners on Grail Country. We had invited Graham, the poet Graham Pardue, to the conversation today. Unfortunately, he had a conflict and was unable to make it. And what we had proposed to talk about today was about the intersection between theology and poetry, because Graham is a poet. But Michael is also a poet, and he has a recently released volume of poetry. Would you like to mention the name of that, Michael?
Mythologies of the Wild of God.
There we go. Mythologies of the Wild God, now available on Amazon. So, with that said, does anyone have any opening thoughts that they'd like to kind of start, prime the conversation with?
So yeah. I don't know about you, but the first place I started to think about poetry in terms of theology, not even theology, of mysticism, was in Evelyn Underhill's classic book, Mysticism. And she has sections on, I think, Blake and the metaphysical poets. And I didn't know anything about it then. I was only like, I don't know, 20, 21 when I encountered that. So I hadn't read any of those poets. But I think encountering that planted a seed. And then I remember getting interested in Blake in my early mid-20s, and then I was working at a bookstore, and this guy came in. He was a pastor, I think, but he was looking for books on Protestant mysticism, which was like, what's Protestant mysticism? And that was another seed that was planted, because basically when I wrote my dissertation, that's what I wrote it on, was Protestant mysticism. No, that's not called that, but and particularly, my doctorates in English literature, like George Herbert and John Donne, they showed a way of encountering God through poetic activity, which was really interesting to me. So I followed up on it. You guys keep my connection was really, our internet's kind of weird out here in the country, so who knows.
Yeah. So, Chris, any while Michael's trying to sort out his connection, do you have any comments on what he just said?
Yeah, I mean, it was breaking up pretty badly for me, but it was making me think about, this is a question I've mused on for a while. Like, I think you can theologize beautifully about poetry. I wonder if you can write a great poem about theologizing. I mean, obviously you can write a great poem about God and about prayer. I wonder if you can if you can theologize about poetry, can you poeticize about theology?
I think it's the only thing you. I mean, honestly, if your poetry is
Wow.
any good, go ahead, Michael. I'll let you talk.
Well, it's not, the theology, I mean, depends on how you're defining theology.
Yeah, that's exactly
But
it.
if you're defining it as a set of propositions, that adhere to this or that set of orthodoxies, then you could, but it's going to be crappy poetry.
And maybe that tells us something about.
But what's interesting to me is
that's where I was going.
That's theology is, or even von Balthasar, draws a distinction between theology at the desk and theology at prayer, or the famous distinction that theology is, I can't remember how it's put, but mysticism being uses the language of the bedroom, right? Whereas theology uses the language in a way you could say of the marketplace. So I think that's one of the interesting things, and having a background in academia, which I'm not proud of, I think I think what we're interested in both of those domains is apprehending truth. But I think the problem with theology is you usually have a committee that you have to check in with. Does this count as truth? And whereas poetry is more
right,
direct,
phenomenologically. But if we think of theology as merely the act of expressing a truth about God, rather than as this specific, like, very propositional academic discipline, then I would say, what I had started to say is that all poetry that it is any good at all is inherently theological, in that sense of theological.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I'm just, as a place to start the conversation, I think it's a way of telling, perhaps a way of telling the worth of the kind of theology we're doing. If it doesn't awaken in us the poetic, then maybe what we're doing isn't worth it, right? Or at least we need to know that about it to judge it rightly.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And the Bible itself is
and I think that's
70% poetry.
Well, and I think you have I read last year, maybe last fall, I was working on this introduction to Novalis.
Oh yeah, that just came out recently, right, Michael?
Christianity or Europe, and the book is very Marian, at least has a Marian dimension, and Barth, being good Lutheran, like, well, hold on, time out, I got to step back, I have to, I don't know if I can go there with you, Novalis. And that's the thing with me with academic theology, we can call it, is whether you're in a Catholic, Orthodox, or Lutheran, or evangelical, or whatever Calvinist context, you have a set of assumptions or even a set of authorities that kind of stand behind, almost like an egregore, right? That stand behind, that are kind of invisible forces behind the interpretation. The dog, making dogs bark. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's my experience of it, and that where in these, like the mentioned metaphysical poets, Thomas Traherne in particular, right, who is an Anglican priest, and he has this extraordinary poetry about the encounter with God and becoming like a child again, and the notion of sin never comes up. The notion of sin never comes up. Or even with Milton, and Milton is not my favorite poet, but his poetic intuition does not include the Trinity. So you read Paradise Lost. There's no Holy Spirit, and the Son is not is an interesting relationship between the Son and the Father. There's no Holy Spirit. It's not a Trinitarian Christianity, right? Not that I think he's correct, but I think, plus he was kind of a maverick and rebelling against everything at the same time. But I think there's, they're two different languages. Theology and poetry are two different domains,
Well, perhaps, but
though I think they can bump up against each other.
Yeah, perhaps, but I think there is a case to make. First of all, as you said, Michael, right from the jump, what we mean when we say theology is slippery. Like what are we even talking about, really? And so, in patristic tradition, theology is shorthand for what we think of as kind of rational discourse, philosophical reflection. That's usually what we mean when we say theology, but it's also a name for Scripture. It's also a name for the beatific vision. It's also a name for God. Like theology just is a way of naming what we think of when we say the doctrine of the Trinity. Like theology is how God knows God, how God is God. So and I think what you're chafing against, and I share that same resistance and kind of discomfort, is a kind of theology that I would say is not only not poetic, but it's actually not good theology, right? It's a kind of dead thinking. You're reproducing, not even reproducing, you're just kind of replicating what you're told you must say. And I would contend that's not good theology. And it's actually not even orthodox, right? That orthodoxy is not the repetition of some dead agreement, where we're just ratifying again and again what's already been said. But I do think, I learned this from Robert Jensen, that theology at its extremes just becomes poetry. Like at some point, theology just verges into poetry. And as Nate has said, there's a way in which all poetry is theological, even if it's not theology in that narrow sense. So yes, they are probably different languages, but I do think there may be more dynamism there than a lot.
Well, I think the book of Job, Chris, is a good example of where those two things come together, where it is both deeply, beautifully poetic book, and also is one of the most demanding theologically at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think that the poetry of the book of Job helps to serve its purposes and making the impact that it does.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. No, that's right. I think for sure.
Yeah.
As I said, I don't have a horse in the race. I guess maybe I do, but I find it a kind of interesting way of framing the problem.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think theology becomes poetry when it forgets its theology. Like in Hans Urs von Balthasar in The Glory.
Can you hear us?
Okay. Well, they've been messing with the. I can hear you and I can see you. They've been messing with we live way out in the country, and they've been playing with our Wi-Fi or our internet. So who knows? But anyway, as I was saying, when I read Balthasar, it blew me away because it didn't seem like theology, and it seemed more like poetry, and it was because it was so heavily imaginative and it seemed free for the most part of the tradition from which it arose.
So what do you think that, so for a theological work to take on those characteristics, what do you think is likely to create the conditions for something like that to happen, for a work to have that kind of flow, for lack of a better word, to it?
Well, I think, honesty, and I think being present to the whatever it is, the text or the scripture, whatever it is. if you feel obligated to come up with a certain conclusion.
Mhm.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah,
I
part of what
often
I'm
think
worried.
that what happens, I describe to people, very often in theology, basically, where it's different from literary criticism. In theology, we have the answer here. Now you get to find a creative way to get to it. Whereas I think, that's not my experience starting from literary criticism or writing poetry, where
Right.
it kind of goes, I don't know what the answer is, but I avoid the cool question, right?
That suggests two things to me. It suggests that creativity is required to do really, truly good theology. And the second of all, that the hyper concern with heresy creates the conditions for us to more likely create theology that is not creative and is just regurgitating what has come before it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is an entirely different conversation. My account as a theologian would be that heresy is much more conservative than orthodoxy is.
Mm-hmm.
Just historically, that's the
Mm-hmm.
way it's actually played out. That's not how it functioned in popular imagination, but that's the way it's played in history. So that Arius is holding the conservative ground against Athanasius, etc. down the line. I mean, this point has been made by a lot of people, so no need to reiterate that. I think that what I love about what Michael is saying right now, for me as a theologian and for my work, is that, to answer your question, Nate, there's an element of freedom and newness, as well as beauty, as well as music, that makes theology poetry. It's not just theology that's written in kind of blue prose, where you've got
Mm-hmm.
some, that it's beautiful to the ear.
Right.
That's not all that makes it poetic. There's also freedom and a kind of openness to the new that would mark it. If I'm hearing Michael rightly, I think that's an essential mark of it. And in that sense, it is kind of casting off restraint, like but in other ways, it's restrained to what's true, right? It's restraining itself to the truth as it's showing itself, rather than just, free association. So I think that's a rich vein, I think, to consider.
Well, I've been reading a lot of Jakob Burma recently because I'm writing an essay, and I was teaching about last week. And what really strikes me with him is because he was not a professional theologian. He didn't, and you see this through history. He didn't know what the rules were, so he didn't know what he couldn't say. And you actually see this too in the 20th century. Here's a camera, here's some film, go make a movie. And he didn't know what the rules were. But he made these remarkable films because he didn't know what the rules were. Just like Jakob Burma didn't know what the rules were for theologians. And he goes, what? I'm just going to, Luther said I could interpret scripture Christian, but it's the people who are on the wild side who are able to bring fertility back to the tradition, because otherwise there tends to be, it's like academia, it's the club, right? We all, you have to conform to the group mind, if you want to get any place, right? This has to be an accepted opinion. And you see this in science too. It's not just theology and philosophy. Scientists do this. The history of science is riddled with corpses that thought they had it all figured out, and there was this one guy who said no.
All right. Well, it looks like he's. Hopefully, he'll be back for this. Chris,
I'm
you
here.
haven't. Oh, okay. Did you you mentioned a filmmaker when you were speaking, and the kind of like the internet latency kind of cut out the name of, for me, I didn't hear the name of the filmmaker. Who was the filmmaker that you mentioned?
Jean Cocteau.
Okay.
Jean
Okay.
Cocteau. Do you know him?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I just didn't catch it.
And he made movies that were crazy, but they were even though
Right.
he didn't know he did not know what the rules were, so he just did what he thought a film.
Yeah, that was kind of like
Right.
that, like,
And then he made one of the greatest films ever made.
That being hyper concerned with the rules is kind of like what I meant when I made the remark about that I did about heresy. But from a historical standpoint, Chris, you're definitely right. Like, definitely most heresies have been the more conservative positions, and orthodoxy has tend to develop over time, and usually the heretical positions are the ones that want to cling to the past. It's definitely historically true. What I meant is in the sense is like the fear of heresy, like the fear of being outside of the rules of the boundaries of what can be said. That's the thing that I had in mind.
Yeah, no, that's I think we're agreed. And one way is that I try to get at that distinction is to make a difference between the conventional Christianity and the tradition, the theological tradition.
Right.
I think that conventional Christianity is what sets the rules in the way that the academy will set conventions for academics in the sciences as well as in theology or philosophy or whatever else. And then those rules put limits on what's possible, what you can and can't say. And that's what I was trying to name earlier with, like, if all we mean by theology is, ratifying already stated agreements, saying again in the same words what's already been said before, I would argue that's not theology. It's also not truly traditional, right? Like that's just conventional. Mm-hmm. And it's dead. It's lifeless. It's deadening. Like, it keeps us from thinking. And what we need, as Michael had put it, is something that kind of refertilizes the conversation. And that is often with figures who break all of those conventions. And it's not accidental that a lot of the theologians in the tradition, think Maximus, for example, Aquinas, in their lifetime are judged by the authorities to be untrustworthy.
Right.
And then after the fact, the church looks back and says, oh no, like that newness was, Athanasius is sent into exile how many times? I'm only saying, I think it's worth making a distinction here between convention and tradition. Otherwise,
I think that's a good distinction. I would like to, what exactly do you think is if you could try to point out toward what the difference is, what would you think? What would you point to try to distinguish that more clearly for folks?
Yeah. I think some of it is convention is concerned with conservation. We want to keep a certain set of rules because we're trying to hold an establishment. We've come to an arrangement we want to preserve. It can be an ideological arrangement. It can be a political arrangement. But we've come to an arrangement we want to preserve, and we want to conserve it by establishing rules that must not be broken. And that the enforcement of those rules is deadening. It kills the soul. It kills the mind. It undoes conversation. And I think this is why, this is the distinction Jaroslav Pelikan makes between the dead faith of the living and the living faith of the dead. Or what makes the faith living is that the conversation is still unfolding, right?
Right.
And there's a scene, Jordan Wood, a mutual friend of ours, Nate, has pointed out this passage to me in Maximus's trial, where Theodosius, who's kind of prosecuting him, says, you have to stay with the way the words read. You must stay with the way the words run. And Maximus says, well, show me how to do that. That isn't already making possible the new, right? Or preserving something old. And I think that's where the tell is. Like, am I open to, if we shift to the language of the Gospel of John, right? The Spirit is leading us into all truth. Robert Jensen will say, precisely to be itself, the gospel can never be said the same way twice. Because the truth is what's the word of the Lord happening to us in order to make life possible, living into the future possible. And if we are just trying to, again, ratify what we've already stated and hold that establishment, that'll never happen. That'll never happen.
Right. Yeah, I definitely think like starting to think of the tradition as a conversation or as an organism is certainly a better way to think about it. I think I like the conversation one in particular, though, because I think it helps connect us back to some kind of continuity with Judaism, because certainly the Jewish tradition has always seen itself as a conversation.
Yes.
We are, so much of what we have depends on that foundation. And so continuing that notion of thinking of the tradition as a living thing, because a conversation is a living thing, right? It's got breath. It's not dead. It's not the dead letter. It's word that has living breath behind it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I'm going to try to log. I'm going to log off and get it on my phone like I did last time.
Okay. We'll welcome you back. We'll keep working on this thread while you try to sort out your connection. Okay, so we were kind of talking about like thinking of the tradition as a living thing. Now, can we tie this back to how does the poetic help us in this task of thinking of the tradition as a living thing, as a conversation? Is it any aid to that goal, or?
Oh, yeah, I think it's an aid in all kinds of ways. I think one is just poetry's intoxication with language. It brings us back to language. Rowan Williams, I think, is very helpful on this point, right? The Edge of Words book, the lectures that book came from. I think that's one thing poetry does. Like it forces us to. It throws us up against the fact that what we're working with is language. What we're working with are words, what they can and can't do, how they do and don't work. And then good poets and good poems refresh those words first. They strangify them, right?
Yeah.
So right. They give us back what had become stale. They re-enliven them, refresh them. So that's a gift. I think they're open to connections that we wouldn't see otherwise, right? So one of the dangers in theology is not just a kind of external authoritarian, fundamentalism, which demands that we say what's already been said and say it exactly as it's been said, but also that we can get in habits of thinking in which we think this leads to that, leads to the other. And poetry disrupts the order of things, right? It offers us a reordering of there's a Jane Hirschfield talks about like tradition.
Hey, welcome back. Yeah, we were just kind of like talking about that thread of like thinking of the tradition as something living or as a conversation, and the way in which the poetic can be an aid to that. That's what we were. Do you have any thoughts on that, Michael?
Well, yeah. One of the things. I'm not saying you don't need the tradition, but the history of the church, or however you want to interpret that word, is as Chris was just saying, is one of calling the original guys up before a committee. It's just every place. But I think a great example of where poetry can do something that theology can't necessarily do is that, I've used it a million times, a famous example from Simone Weil, who was interested in Christianity, but didn't have a religious background at all. He came from an atheist Jewish family, very secular. but she was getting drawn and drawn closer and closer to Catholicism. And when a priest gave her a copy of the poems of the metaphysical poets, she really fell in love with George Herbert's poem Love 3. And she loved it so much that she translated it into French. And whenever she felt a migraine coming on, she would start to recite it. I mean, originally it was just a way to calm herself, get her mind off of the migraine. But as she wrote in a letter, that after a while, during one of these recitations, as she wrote, Christ himself came down and took possession of me. And I think but that's the experience. And I think, those of us who fall in love with God or music or poetry or nature or whatever, that's because we have these moments where something breaks through and takes possession of us, which imparts meaning to our lives, right? That we're not just confined to a scientific materialistic worldview, that there's something more. There's a plus, there's a yes. And that, my experience, those experiences, what I think happens, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people, is then they turn to philosophy or theology from there, trying to explain what that experience they had, which can be good, but can also not be good, right? So, I mean, I don't know I don't think there's a formula. I don't know the answer to this conundrum, right? Because there's something that happens that people tend to ruin things, right? And you get them into groups or faculties or seminaries. You know what I mean? They just kind of suck all the fun out of it. And they don't want anybody stepping out of line, acting different than the rest of the guys, right? So, and I don't know what to do about that, but I do know that, and this is what I've been really, and Nate, this, a year ago, I was dwelling on this question, and I still am, whether or not Christianity is discoverable organically or phenomenologically. It's got to be. But it scares people, right? Well, it scares the authorities. But you see this with Blake, you see it with so many, Marguerite Porretta, you see it with so many poets and mystics, that they come up with an insight and it puts them immediately into conflict with authority. Happened to Jakob Burma, where he was denounced from the pulpit by his own pastor. Right. So I think it's part of what happens. It's part of what happens. Henry Vaughan, or his brother Thomas Vaughan, or Robert Herrick, I'm teaching him up tomorrow, they were kicked out of their livings as priests because those in power didn't like it, right? And so there's an interesting, I mean, it's the one and the many, right? There's something really, tragically human about this, but also transcendent at the same time.
I wonder if one way of putting this, and I'll put this question. I know it's Nate, it's your show, but I want to ask Michael a question if it's all right.
Go for it. My hope is for you guys to do most of the talking.
I wonder if, like, a way of putting this is, and this was kind of the original thread I was trying to pull when I said, I don't know that you can write a poem about theologizing. You can write a poem about God, that's theological, but I don't know that you can write a good poem about theology. What I was trying to get at, I think, what I was intuiting there with that question is, theology is a very modest work. Even at its best, it's doing something that's only ever in service of something else. It cannot be glorious in itself. When it becomes glorious, it's become poetry, it's become liturgy, it's become prayer, it's become something beyond itself. To your point about Balthasar's, glory of the Lord, but I wonder, we've been asking what poetry can do for theology, but I wonder if theology keeps its modesty, how it might serve poetry. knowing that poetry is going to be glorious and beautiful in a way that theology won't be. Could it serve? In other words, and what's made me think that is Vey. Is Herbert's and Herrick's, their training as priests, does it serve their poetry? Hopkins, like, do we get that poetry if he doesn't have the theology to resource, to work with? Right. So you're right. You're naming some, obviously, a truth here, that once that poetry comes, it's often met with critique and resistance. I guess I'm asking about the other side of it. Could that poetry have come? Could we have Hopkins or Herrick or Herbert without the theological serving them?
Well, let me give you an example. Because this is something that was written before Christianity, I think. It's the first poem in the very famous Oxford Book of English Mystical Verse, and it's attributed to American. I am the wind which breathes upon the sea. I am the wave of the ocean. I am the murmur of the billows. I am the ox of the seven combats. I am the vulture upon the rocks. I am the beam of the sun. I am the fairest of plants. I am a wild boar in valor. I am a salmon in the water. I am a lake in the plain. I am a word of science. I am the point of the lance in battle. I am the God who creates in the head the fire. Who is it who throws light into the meeting on the mountain? Who announces the ages of the moon? Who teaches the place where couches the sun? So, for me, when I first read that poem, I don't know how long ago it was, I thought it was a Christian poem, and I think it still is. But I don't know. I think it may have been a Christian poem prior to Christianity arriving in England. And I think that's the kind of thing that's tickling me these days. I don't mean in a laughter way. Is that I think people do develop intuitions about the world, the cosmos and of divinity, outside of the structures available to us. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's the only. It's of course, you can have there are all kinds of intuitions you can come to, but and I think what happens when we come to these intuitions, if we come upon them, you kind of recognize it as true, right? This is true. I know this is true. You can't convince me otherwise. You don't. This. Now, and we also know, and this is what maybe what the gift of poets is that when we try to articulate what those experiences may have been, it starts to sound horrible, or it's like the golden dreams or something, right? It just kind of falls apart. Mm-hmm. We don't have a language for that, and I think what you notice through the mystical tradition, Burma, I'm thinking about because I've been reading a lot lately, but they often have to come up with a new vocabulary, and this new vocabulary is so foreign to the way everyone else is speaking about God, but they don't have the right language, so they have to kind of fashion one or something, right? Yeah. And which is interesting, and to me that's when you're onto something, when you've discovered something. Blake is the same way. Mm-hmm. It took me a long time to understand Blake in the prophetic works anyway. Took me a long time to understand Burma because of reading both, or Rudolf Steiner, right? For all three of them, I had to learn a new vocabulary, a new language before I could enter into what they were saying. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot of work, right? For the reader. Yes. And it takes a lot of work for the writer, for the poet as well, and that's why people thought Blake was insane. Mm-hmm. They thought he was not mad. He was not. He was actually probably the most sane man in England at the time. But you come back from the mountainside, like with Moses, right? He has to veil his face after he goes to the mountain, because, and then he has to speak through Aaron, because you're not the same guy.
Mm-hmm.
Been transformed, right? And it's I don't know, and I don't know where we go with that, because, as I mentioned earlier, the problem of the one and the many, right? This is the one's experience, but then, what happens when you try to bring it down from the mountain and share it with people? Well,
Yeah.
that what happened with Moses? They screwed it up,
Mm-hmm.
right? No, you idiots! It's not what you were supposed to be doing. So
I think you put your finger on something with Aaron and the Aaronic, the priestly, the mediating, and I think you had logged off, Michael, when I was making this distinction. But one of the handles I use for this conversation is a difference between the conventional and the traditional. But I think inside the conventional, I mean, we do need convention to just share life at all.
I know.
Right? It's always bending back against us, right? It's always threatening. It's necessary to make shared life, common life possible, but it also threatens the abundance and the truth of that life, right? Precisely by making something common for us, it threatens to make it common and to strip from it beauty and goodness and truth. So I mean, obviously, we're not going to solve this problem, but I think it is the problem we're up against, and it's embodied in Aaron in those texts. So, like, there are times in which Aaron stands with Moses in intercession. He's a changed man with Moses, and then there are times when he's far from Moses, and he's the one who makes the golden calf.
Yep,
right? He's the one who creates the idol that leads to the undoing of the people. So I
sorry, bro, it was a good idea at the time.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So this is it, right? This is, which is what makes the work of the priest, the work of the minister. I mean, you're standing right on the point where things go wrong, and which means you better be nimble, and you better be ready to stay small, to get small.
Right.
And if you can't, disastrous.
Yeah. Now let me ask you this. So, also when I'm preparing for this essay, I've been reading a lot, or at least going over my notes and marginalia from Nicholas Berdyaev. And he and Blake, what they have in common is a prophetic vein, right? And I wonder if the church, as we have inherited it and understand it, I don't know, I would say is absolutely or almost entirely lacking in the prophetic dimension. So then we lack that, we're left with tradition or convention or whatever you want to call it, right? So, and maybe I'm just out of touch. And to me, these poets seem to, some of them anyway, seem to touch on the prophetic, right? And so let me just ask you, as a professional theologian who knows more about the field and the world than I do, where is it? Where is that prophetic tradition right now?
Yeah, so I think it is far too rare, especially in the professional class. I mean, Ivan Illich, I'm deeply influenced here by him, that the professionalization of ministry, as well as the professionalization of care, is, undoes us, right? It becomes counterproductive. Yeah. It becomes counterproductive. Right. I do think when I'm saying tradition, I'm really meaning a living counter witness to the conventional. So I'll sometimes say to my students, right, that when we say the tradition, we're talking about a minority of voices who have witnessed against what most of us have done through time, right? So by tradition, I don't just mean the aggregate or the
Right.
what's been most common in Christian history. I think these figures, the figures whose work kind of continues to make contribution, they're figures, to your point, Michael, who in their life were brought up before councils. They're confessors, or they're martyrs, or they were exiled. And I actually, you can't tell their stories without telling the stories of authorities who tried to shut them down, grand inquisitors who tried to silence them. And that this is just one of the marks of theology that's going to be worth anything a generation later, is it's coming up out of the life of people who recognize the ways in which convention is shutting down the life that must be lived, and they're resisting it. And I think those people are here. They're operating now. But of course they're few, right? Like there aren't many of them, and there are too few, no doubt. I mean, I think this is something that we should grieve. But to me, it's not because there's something inherent in theology that makes the prophetic impossible. There's something inherent in professionalization that makes all of this work impossible. So the enemy, I would contend, is not theology. Not that you're saying that, but the enemy is not theology. It's convention and professionalization. Like, that's where the risk is, right? That's where we lose ourselves.
Institutionalization is the enemy, right? But it's where was I going?
I wasn't answering your question. Let me say this. So Willie Jennings, to name a theologian who, a contemporary, the reason he's top of mind is I've edited a piece he contributed to a journal, and I'm editing the responses. And he has a section in the article that he submitted on the idolatry of coupling. And he says, that the churches in America, he's talking about American Christianity, the churches in America have idolized the couple and have made coupling, making couples, married pairs, like the end all be all of the church's work. And that this is incredibly dehumanizing, destructive, right? That's a prophetic edge, right? He's naming something like Ivan Illich did that absolutely has to be named. And I think Jennings is a good example of a theologian whose theology is poetic and prophetic. And of course, have him tell his story sometime, right? Like, he's a man with a lot of wounds for just that reason. So I think there are figures who are doing it. But when we think about the state of theology today, in an academic sense, no. I mean, it is a grievous thing mostly. It's embarrassing, honestly.
Yeah, well, I know. I mean, it's not just academic theology; it's academic everything is rather a state. And I think when you talk about the American church, and this one of my favorite questions for the last couple of years is, people say the church. It's, what do you mean by the church? What do you mean by that term, the church?
Yes. And
it surprises me how, well, it doesn't surprise me, but how few people can actually give a clear answer about that.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, it's a glittering generality in a way. It's a word we think we know what it means because I use it all the time. And I don't know what it means. I'm willing to admit I do not know. I think it means something other than what I have thought about that it meant my whole life, but I don't know exactly what it means.
Yeah.
That's great. And it's interesting. I mean, so we're coming to this conference in September, right? And with professional churchmen. And I'm like, okay, I don't know what the church is. So I'm going to come. But I don't know what the church is. Can somebody tell me before? Because that's one of the basic terms you would think we would have agreement on. And we don't.
Mm-hmm.
We do not.
We don't. Yeah. So a couple of notes, not that this answers your question, but it's a gesture toward an answer, I think. One is, when we say church, I think mostly we mean the people I know who call themselves Christian, right? Which is something else, right? Like that. And I'll often stop my students with, don't say the church, don't say Christianity. What you mean is some people who call themselves Christian, and try to be as precise as you can. John Baer, who's an Orthodox theologian and priest, he's made a really helpful distinction between the church and what we might call kind of clerical jurisdictions. Like, we must not think of the church simply as its institutional arrangements. So, riffing on him, what I've said is the church
I
is
would
where
suggest that that's when people hear that term, the church, that's exactly what they think of right away.
That's right. So I think exactly. So I think by church we either mean a group of people that we've grouped together because they all share a common language or identity, or we mean the institutional arrangements, right? And I that theologically, that's not what we mean by church. What we mean by church is something more like wherever Christ's body is present in the world, wherever his life is happening. Like, church is the happening of Christ in the world, the phenomena of Christ's love and care. But of course, that's not the way the word works in casual conversation. I know that.
I know. And that's, I often think of this great, I don't even know where it comes from, but I heard this story attributed to Rudolf Steiner about saying that he wished that every day he could have a different word for anthroposophy, because people get so stuck on what they think that word means that it starts to have no meaning at all. And of course, we've been using this word, the church, for ecclesia, for 2,000 some years now. And I don't know what it means. But I do like, when you were talking about the presence of Christ, or we can say the parousia, right? It's not the second coming. It's the presence, right? The presence of the Lord, and which has, and I think you see this, right? It has cosmological dimensions to it. In fact, it's probably primarily a cosmological reality rather than a conceptual one. Because we want to think we know what the church is, but I think we think about the cosmological dimensions of it, right? Which is where wonder and beauty come into it, right? Which is, primarily the vehicle of poetry. Is wonder, beauty, and astonishment. Where something shines through a poem and you're taken aback, or a piece of music, or whatever it happens to be, a scripture, right? And we know the experience, right? You read scripture. Same passage of scripture, you read it 150 times, and then you read it this one time, and you're like, wait a minute, I gotta take a minute, right? Let's all pause while I absorb this. So I think, I wouldn't call that the church. I would call that indications or intuitions of what I'm thinking that the church is, probably.
I can go with that.
Can you go with that, Nate?
Yeah, that works for me. Because Chris had brought up Ivan Illich before, it's like, so it has the church become a plastic word? Is that what's happened to it? So that we've actually just like made it so that it has no meaning at all?
Well, it's like what Heidegger talks about, the impoverishment of, right? Well, it's an impoverished word,
Right.
Yeah. Deflated currency.
A couple of spaces where it still has heft, but ironically, at least popular evangelicalism in America tries to take those away. So, for instance, in my circles, Michael, which is mostly Pentecostal and non-denominational, post-denominational Pentecostal charismatic world, there's a lot of talk about we are the church. It's not a building, and what matters is the way we're living the life of God all the time, not what happens on Sunday morning. But I actually think the place where the word church still has some integrity is the building where we go on Sunday to worship. And I don't think we want to lose that. Now, we need more than that in the word. We needed to be doing more than that. But I think, phrases like going to church, having church, still have a little bit of, there's some solidity there. Ironically, though, we're actively working to undo those references, right? So that it's becoming, I think, less and less meaningful to say those things. I mean, I can't tell you how often in a lecture or a conversation I will make reference to going to church or the church as a building, and someone will correct me, weigh in to let me know, oh, that's not what the church is. And I'm like, you don't realize what you're doing, right? Like those, that's not all that the church is, of course. Like, in fact, I don't think we can say all that the church is, because I think we're ultimately talking about an infinitized reality, which is why, Michael, I like your language of intimations or indications of this unnameable reality that we can never quite catch up to. I think that's much closer to right. But we don't get there by undercutting what's still useful in the language of church, right? And so, I mean, that's an aside, really. But as a bishop and a churchman, I think I still love that there are places, there are chapels and cathedrals and sanctuaries, many of them quite beautiful, that are named when we use that word, and that the gathering for prayer together, we still have some sense of what that means. I would hate for us to lose that altogether.
Earlier in the conversation, we were making reference to the fact that one of the things that poetry does is it revivifies words and renews them. So if the word church is going to, and in this case, I don't know if it's a case of revivification necessarily, because I don't know that we've ever had a good sense. Like, I don't think I could point to a point in Christian history and say, oh, we really knew what the church was then. I think the church is something that is almost impossible for us to comprehend.
That's it.
That escapes us by design, that we're moving toward the understanding of. And I think there's a role for both theology in the best sense that we've been talking about it, and poetry to help us to come into an understanding of that word so that it actually really gains life and power.
That's exactly right. And again, I'll look at the history of theology. You don't have ancient and medieval ecclesiologies. People don't write separate doctrines of the church because they don't think of the church as an object to be studied in that way. Right? That's a modern phenomenon, to think about the church as a kind of locus of thought it's a modern assumption that you could do that. And I think it's because you can't do that, right? Like, it is the body of Christ, right? And there's no catching up to that. We can say some meaningful things about it, but there's no way to say everything that needs to be said about it, or to predict what you might have to say tomorrow about it, given what you said yesterday. I think, but of course, I would contend that's true of every locus, not just ecclesiology, but it's particularly acute there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, what kinds of Michael, you were talking about the lack of the prophetic earlier. And to the, like, I would like you to revisit that idea of the lack of the prophetic and how that relates to both the poetic and the theological vocation, and how that might help us with this, give some real life to this kind of hollow concept of the church that's just sort of an empty signifier at the moment for us, mostly.
Well, that's part of the reason, actually, why I wrote Mythologies of the Wild of God, was that actually grew out of my last poetry book, which in that book, it's called Meditation in Times of, kind of use, though not by name, use John the Baptist as an image
for the poet.
Mhm.
And well, actually, I wrote a chapter in Transfiguration on that, where the idea is that John the Baptist calls Christ from the future, right? In a way, and that is part of the prophetic vocation of poetry. Not every poem, all poetry is prophetic. The prophetic dimensions of poetry should do precisely that. Call
Yeah,
Christ from the future.
that's really resonant with me, Michael, because I had that conversation about a year and a half ago with Ted, and I spent like a good chunk of that conversation talking about the way in which the poetic vocation is witness, which just runs right into that your intuition there about John the Baptist.
Yeah, and I think so that's important. And like I mentioned, Berdyaev and what's his name? Berdyaev and Blake, right? Blake. And Burma, all the B's. Maybe you have to have a last name that begins with B, but they all accessed that kind of and I wouldn't. Well, in a way, I wouldn't call Burma a prophet in the same way that Berdyaev, who is more eschatologically aware, or Blake, who also was. But I think Burma is unafraid to call the truth, which is what the prophets did in the Old Testament, right? They weren't afraid to witness, to say what they saw, right? Mm-hmm. And because it was their vocation, it was their calling, vocare. They were called to do this, right? And not every poet does this, but there are a number of poets through history who have done precisely that. And I think Thomas Merton was probably one, especially when he wrote his poem Hagia Sophia, or you see it in Teilhard de Chardin, right? Where there is certainly a prophetic infusion there. And when you read Teilhard and you read Balthazar, they are so poetic in their expression that it's some of the more beautiful theological writing that you'll ever encounter, right? And I think that's one of the things that happens when I know how this is with writing, right? Sometimes you get into the zone, or you don't even know what you're doing, and then you read it later. You're wow, I wrote that. Where'd that come from? Because right,
that's exactly it, Michael. That's why I related to this idea of witness. It's because it's just like you just have to be a witness for what it is that's moving through you as you write the poem.
Yes, but who you are as a witness matters, right? So like there's a way of romanticizing, not that you're doing this, Nate, but I think there's a way of thinking of the poet and also the novelist or the preacher or the prophet as simply a channel for this alien word that possesses, But what we see in the craft of, Dostoevsky, pick your prophet or poet. There is craft there, right? Like the shape of the witness, who they are, does bear on the way in which that truth gets witnessed by them. And I think there's a kind of sweet spot here in which we want to say, in some sense, you're shocked, right, Michael, that you wrote that, but you were ready to write that.
Right. It couldn't have come from anybody else.
You were ready to write that. So it is you, but it's you kind of at your truest. It's you kind of coming to that place where so it's not like you've been rendered vacuous by it. It's not a possession, right? It is an attunement, a kind of realization of that is my voice. It's not what I knew as my voice, perhaps, or at least I'm not always speaking in that voice, but it's there. So I'm. Is this getting, Nate, at what you're asking?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I would say, like, ultimately, like what we're talking about when we're talking about that experience of, like, I don't even know how I did this. It's an experience of a flow state, and a flow state is definitely not a possession. And your ability to get into a flow state is directly correlated into how much effort and practice and energy you have put into the thing in which you are able to enter a flow state. Like, you have to have certain expertise that you've developed in that activity in order to be able to get to that place. But when you're in that place, it's like you don't know how you did it.
Mm-hmm. I don't remember who said it, but you guys will probably remember that visions come to prepared spirits.
Yeah,
visions.
That's exactly right. Yeah,
and I think there's an analogy with music, right? With playing music, not listening to music. Because people who are proficient at their instrument, you may go through all the stuff of learning the scales and practice. But you get to a point as a musician where you forget all that stuff and you can be present to the music. And things happen, which I call it mysticism. Right? Just what happened there? That was so crazy. That was so beautiful. And you see this with jazz players a lot. And improvisation. Well, that improvisation doesn't happen with, thousands of hours of practicing scales.
Yeah.
But there's something that happens when you kind of step off into infinity, right?
Well, this is why Tom Berg like the very first meditation. The meditations on the tarot is the magician, and the teaching of the magician is this art of concentration without effort, which is exactly what we're talking about. But that place of, you don't get to that place of concentration without effort, without a whole lot of effort along the way beforehand. So,
yeah.
There is, I don't know if either of you read Benjamin Fondon, who was, died in the Holocaust, a kind of Romanian poet living in Paris. And he was a disciple of Lev Shestov, would have known Bulgakov and others in Paris, around that time. And in The Fire in the Cloud, Nate, that you mentioned, I have a chapter where I'm contrasting Fondon and Calvin, actually, and their experiences and how they account for their experiences. Now, I don't want to unpack all of that here, but I think it's a good test case for what we've been discussing, in that there's Fondon's poetry allows him to witness what he's suffering and what others are suffering in a way that Calvin's theology does not allow him, even though I'm focused on his sermons on Micah. So he's working with a poem, an ancient poem, Micah's Prophecies, but he's not a poet.
He's a lawyer,
Calvin. And it shows.
Yeah.
It shows. And I think, I'm sure Calvinists will find my reading of him unfair, and fair enough. But when I read him, I feel a constriction. Like, Fondon is bearing witness to this horrible, horrible evil, and yet, as an inheritor of that prophetic tradition, Micah's prophetic tradition, he's able to bear witness in a way in which he does really triumph over it, even if it takes his life. His poetry gets the last word. But Calvin's sermons there's a resignation to them. I say something in the chapter about how the irony is you start to feel that Calvin doesn't think anything is possible for God. And Fondon keeps talking about that all things are possible for God. And I do think what we're calling poetry here has to do with that sense of difference. Like, for the poet, all things are possible.
Right.
For the poet, all things are possible. And maybe what we're naming here really is not poetry, but the full openness of the human spirit. That the human spirit, when it's truly open, knows that all things are possible.
Right.
And poetry is just a way of naming the opening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think that's good. That's good. That's good. Before we wrap up, I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about the conference that we have coming up in September. The conference, I wanted to keep the conference theme as loose as possible to give broad leeway to our speakers to kind of to kind of riff on it however they wanted. So the theme is encountering face to face. Do either of you have any thoughts about what you might be speaking about at the conference? Either one of you can go first.
Well, I've been thinking about this idea of what church is.
Hmm.
Out there for a second.
You said you've been thinking about this idea of what church is, and you're about to talk about how you're going to relate that to the encountering face to face.
Yeah, and then that's because I think the encounter face to face. That's so, and that's been my experience recently. It was not out there. My experience recently of how church has small, beautiful.
You said something about thinking of church as an encounter. Is that what you?
Well, because we. You guys breaking up.
Yeah, your connection's like. We'll circle back around. Hey, Michael, I'll go ahead and circle back around to you after maybe your connection can get this better, and then.
That's why my wife's moving stuff on me. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Should be better.
Okay. You were talking about that you've been thinking about this idea of the church, and you might talk about the church, and then you were trying to say how you're connecting that to this theme of face-to-face encounter.
No. Yes. So because we are, that's what my experience for the last couple of years of church has been house church. And, the kind of small is beautiful model. And so I wanted to not necessarily talk only about that, but that seemed to be a good jumping off point because I don't know what you guys, but so many churches seem, and I'm talking about the Sunday experience, seem huge and anonymous, right? Or too big. What attracted when we were Byzantine Catholic for 25 years. What was attractive about that is because it was small, and I knew everybody's name, which is nice, right? And I think that is the encounter face to face, right? And the Gospels are filled with encounters of Jesus face to face with people, are the best moments in the Gospels.
Yeah.
Whether it's at the resurrection with Mary Magdalene or other moments where he encountered someone and he says, "You're not far from the kingdom," right? Or we just read, was it last week? The woman taken in adultery. We read that for the feast of Saint Mary Magdalene. And I love it because in there, people say, "Well, what about go and sin no more?" People like that part, right? But they often forget that Jesus gets rid of those guys before he even asks that, right? He writes in the sand before he says, "Go and sin no more." It's like, well, do you deserve this? He gives before, and there's that line from Dante's Prayer of the Virgin that oftentimes thy charity arrives before the plea, right? We forget about that, but that all happens in a personal way, and that's what we often. And we live in a world that is less and less an encounter face to face, right?
Yeah. So I've got an idea, Nate. You and Michael, I'll resource you right now. You can tell me whether this is worth. I'll workshop it in the moment. You're the focus group. So I'm writing this third volume in the Christology series on. This is the dogmatic Christology, and it's organized around the wounds of Christ. So the 5 holy wounds. But I want the final chapter to be on. So the 5 holy wounds are the 5 piercings of Christ. Of course, he suffered more wounding than that, but in the resurrection, those are the wounds that remain. Not all the wounds that he suffered remain, but these remain. But it's the wounding gaze. So we have this image of Peter denying Christ and then seeing him and seeing that he's seen by him. So there's a moment after the denials where Peter sees that Christ is gazing upon him and he is pierced. So there's the ways in which Christ himself is pierced, but then there's his piercing gaze, like the way in which his look affects those he looks upon. And I'm interested in what we make of that. What is the wounding gaze of love that and how do we see it now? Like, how is Christ's piercing gaze happening to me? And there are a number of stories. Simone Weil's story actually is an example of this, because I think that's what Herbert's poem is about, really, about drawing back from, like, not being able to meet the eye of Christ. Right. And then there's a story David Milch tells about his own conversion, if we can call it that, of a Catholic priest who looked at him, he said, as if he knew something about me I didn't yet know about myself. And so I'm interested in that, like the phenomenology of the knowing look, the piercing gaze, meeting the eye of Christ. So that's the idea.
That's great, Chris. And it plays in really nicely with we have a quote on the website for the conference. We have a quote from C.S. Lewis's Still We Have Faces. And I think the reason we need the wounding gaze is that it's part of what helps give us a real face and shatters our masks.
Yes. That's so. I will write that down and not give you credit for it.
No problem. Steal away. Michael, you'd started to say something.
No, I wasn't. I was just agreeing.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank you both again for coming and joining me today. I'll send you the link when I have this up. I might ask Paul to put it up on his channel too, for the purposes of promoting the conference. But it's just always a delight to talk to the two of you. Hopefully next time, Michael, you'll have less of a connection problem. I'm going to probably send this one over to Jesper Viance, who's doing the tech for the conference, he's a audio video wizard, and see if he can do something to kind of like
clean it up. Yeah,
clean it up a little bit because of the technical problems that we had. But once I get it posted, I'll let you both know. And as always, just like thank you both again. It's just
thank you.
Like,
Michael,
like really meant that when I said two of my favorite people to talk to.
So it was fun. It was a lot of fun.
It was.
Thanks so much for giving me.
I'll be in touch. All right.
Bless you.
Take care.